Okay, well, we won't be dealing with one or two cases. We'll actually be dealing with a group of cases, and we'll group it so that it doesn't feel too threatening for some of you, especially those who already grew up in the culture in whatever country or institution you're in, or in whatever place you're training in. These are the kind of things you might see yourself doing because your entire team or your entire group, even your teachers, telling you that this is the way we do things. And of course, initially, if you're just a junior trainee, the lowest in the totem pole of trainees, you're the youngest one, something inside you is telling you it doesn't seem right. Like, especially if you came from a very ethical or moral or conservative background and you entered medicine thinking that, well, you're thinking that doctors have a good life, but well, you can actually earn a lot of money and have a good life doing things which are a lot easier and which takes less than 8 years to finish. And so you also enter there because you're thinking this is a good thing. I mean, helping people who are sick, and suddenly you're already in it, in your third year or fourth year of training, then, or maybe even junior residency. And then you get exposed to the actual practice, dealing with things which concern low resources, decision to send people home, defer certain treatments, and things like that. And there's something in your brain is telling you, well, it doesn't look right and it doesn't feel right, but then everybody and the entire environment is telling you that it's right. Well, my advice or my suggestion to you is you are probably right. So probably it's immoral or unethical as far as your society or your community is concerned. The internal environment and the internal culture and the internal values of that place or that community you're in, just a group of doctors inside a very busy, usually fairly corrupt metropolitan area, or in a country, most of the time does not reflect the actual values and the ethical perspectives or the ethical inclinations of the community or the country in general, especially if you're in a country that's very steeped in the Christian, Judeo-Christian, Christian or Catholic tradition. And if you begin to doubt whether it's actually legal or not, then my suggestion is if you're in such a place or institution, then you're probably right. It's probably illegal. And you're just following the golden rule for corrupt illegal practices in private and government institutions, meaning it's not illegal if you don't get caught. And that has a sister principle as far as ethics and morality is concerned. It's not immoral and it's not unethical as long as all of you think within the group or within your organization, or maybe hopefully not the entire profession, as long as all of you within that subgroup thinks it's not immoral or unethical, or even if it is, then all of you in that group feel like it's acceptable or excusable or justifiable. Okay, so ethical and moral is sort of not that important, and I personally think it's partly due to the fact that everybody wanted to follow the Western trend and become secular, so you took out the basis of values and morality in most places, which is the Judeo-Christian, Christian or Catholic values and morality, and then you replaced it with something relativistic. Actually, you replaced it with absolutely nothing. You just weakened the foundations. That's really what happened as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, and you couple it with the encroachment of really questionable, corrupt personalities. Once you introduce corruption, moral corruption, and all sorts of corruption within institutions, private or government, then it's like a virus that keeps on getting worse, and the moral or the ethical infection. So if you think if something inside you tells you that it's immoral, then you're probably right. And if something inside you tells you that it feels illegal, then you're probably right. If you're in the right context. I'm not going to be specific about what place, what institution, what country, or what context. That's up to you. Okay? So that's my disclaimer. So let's start with cases involving or related to informed consents and informed decisions. Right? Now, a simple case would be someone is sitting in a restaurant, and then you approach the person and then you grab his hand, and then you got a needle, IV needle, and attempted to poke the person or poke the needle into the person's vein. What do you call that? Well, if you just threatened to grab the person and insert the needle, it actually didn't cause that much harm. Maybe grabbing a little bit, but not too tight. In some countries, that would be sort of excusable. They probably think you're crazy, but so that would be assault. It's a threat, right? So a threat of actually inserting the needle. Now, if you grab the patient really roughly, even if you're not inserting the needle, especially if you inserted the needle through the person's arm, and it's painful, and it goes through the vein, that's battery, right? So, and usually it goes together. So that's a charge of assault and battery. So that's one thing you might get out of the situation if you don't do decent, well-documented, informed decision-making or informed consent while delivering medical care inside your clinic or inside the hospital. So that would be a charge of assault and battery. You did something that threatened harm, especially physical harm. It could be other harms for some places, but usually physical harm, and the consent was invalid, or there was no consent, or you didn't do it too well, or you didn't do it well, and then the consent is invalid. That's still assault and battery. So that's assault and battery. Okay. Usually you're after the legal part to make it look legal, and the ethical and moral doesn't hold a lot of water nowadays, unfortunately. Everybody just wants to make sure that they get away with it or it gets done. You know, if you're in that kind of environment, then you have to be extra careful, because unless you're going along with it and your sense of morality and values align with it. And this is not a lecture for that. I mean, if you want to learn those things, you go to corrupt places who are doing so well. In some countries, it would be some units in the customs area or the tax or finance areas. You go there and learn the stuff, like, from the macro level. It's just a matter of, fudge the law, make it look vague, and then, create policies and procedure which looks like it's following the law, but it's actually introducing a whole bunch of stuff that make us do the opposite of what law says, but it doesn't look like that on the surface, and create all sorts of committees or investigative institutions or levels of investigation below that before the poor patient and family can get to court. Or let's make it hard for them to realize that they actually had been wronged and they can actually complain. Or even if they complain, let's make it very hard for them to get to court, right? And that's so easy. You don't need to do a lot of stuff if you're dealing with very poor, low-resourced victims, right? So our patients, our families, complaining, getting a lawyer, even assuming that they have access to charity legal stuff, right? The public attorney's office or some charitable lawyer, it will still take time and days out of work and a lot of harassment and all sorts of things. And they'll probably won't get to the end. They'll just probably quit after several months of trying, right? Anyway, so if you want to learn those things, this is not the place for that. Anyway, that's assault and battery. But there are other ways it can be charged, like, for example, negligently obtained informed consent. So and of course, this is not a lecture of how to do consent well, but I can give you examples like DNR, deny. That would be a consent not to do, right? Or consent to not to put a feeding tube, or an informed decision to go home against medical advice, and the values and the sense of morality of the environment you're in is all screwed up. And the idea is to get this person to consent by whatever means, not really consent, but just to make the person sign the paper. That's really a crazy, malicious kind of, probably malevolent or evil kind of environment, and you can be inside one, or are very confused, morally confused, or hopefully just that. Just give them something like, do you want to be inside this hospital forever and die here? Then you can take off the ventilator and be in an ambulance and get to your province or get to your distant town or city 4 hours away and be with your family for a few days and die peacefully with family. And that's not going to happen. You just took off the guy's ventilator, just took off the guy's mannitol, and that's increasing cranial pressure. And she's not going to be able to get to the house. And if ever he gets there, it's just going to cause a whole bunch of traumatic experiences too, because he's not going to be peaceful. He's just gasping for breath or shouting with severe headache and throwing up all over the place, right? So, but of course you're not going to say that, because the idea is just to say something so that they sign the paper to make it look ethical, moral, or legal. In many places where it feels like you can get away with it, you're actually not getting valid consents. The idea is just to get the patient's signature on paper. So if somebody questions it, you show the paper and it's signed, and hopefully everything stops there. Now, if the patient complains or family complains, then you show the paper and you try to get into a drawn out negotiation or argument or debate with your legal team against their legal team. And now, of course, if the patient's smart enough, they'll go for social media or mass media, and then you get in trouble, and then you try to get some kind of deal. You pay out of court, you settle out of court, and that's usually what happens in many places, even in developed countries. Once it becomes a court case, then you're in trouble. Everything gets questioned. You can have 2 to 3 more cases related to that particular complaint filed against you. It can even turn into a criminal case. So you have all sorts of things, and then everybody will know about it. And then if one of those cases succeed, then you have your license on the line. And so most health providers, doctors, especially doctors, not really nurses, but sometimes nurses, try to settle. But of course, they try their best not for it not to go there. They try to tire the patient out, and that's easy again if the patient is very poor, disempowered, and low-resourced. You try to tire them out, and last resort is you go for a settlement. Now, of course, not everyone can be bought, so especially if you caused some really terrible harm, and they learned about it. Now, what's pretty obvious is if the patient's not poorly resourced and not that poor and has access to legal stuff, especially if members of the family are fairly knowledgeable in terms of their rights, patient's bill of rights, and the legality of things don't turn out that way. So if you're training in a place dealing with poorly resourced patients, and you're doing it this way, and then you go to a developed country, Singapore or United States, a developed part of the United States, or in some big hospital in your country, probably mostly dealing with the rich folk and tourists who can afford to pay for services. You don't do the thing that you're going to do in training, you'll get in trouble. In those cases, even the hospital is very careful. I mean, they can get your accreditation questioned. Of course, the hospital would rather have you get in trouble rather than them and all the other doctors in the hospital get in trouble. So don't do that. You'll land in jail, or you'll be paying that person a huge sum of money in damages, So the bottom line is, just because it looks like everyone's getting away with it in training, whatever that place or institution might be, it doesn't mean you'll get away with it in any other place. So be careful. Now, if it's a civil case, like say malpractice or negligence, malpractice is based on the standards of care, and you have to define it. Or if it goes to court, and people will bring in people from your profession or bring in experts to tell everyone what the standards of practice is. And malpractice is you didn't practice according to standard. That's pretty much what it means. In the old days, it just refers to practice. Like, you didn't decide on the right medication. You didn't decide on the right test. You didn't pick up on a very obvious thing that everybody would have picked up, or you didn't manage the case well. Or it could be a surgical case. You didn't perform the surgery well, up to par with the standard level of, considering the standard level of competency, So that's malpractice. What's the usual standard practice? Did you do it, or did you do it poorly, or did you not do it at all? A poor practice case, a wrong practice case or a malpractice case. Negligence would be a breach of duty, like for example, you're negligent, of course. So for example, a health provider or a doctor, and so you have a duty and you're in charge of taking care of the patient. So there are certain duties and obligations to that patient. You have to be doing something. There's a contract, there's an agreement between you and the patient and the patient's family, and then you didn't do your duties. So poorly, carelessly, or you didn't do it at all. That's a place where the informed consent case can come in. Like for example, you didn't do it at all. You didn't do CPR and you didn't get the consent, or you have a poorly obtained consent or an legally invalid consent. So, and you didn't do the CPR. So it's this breach of duty, or you send the patient home, or you force the patient to go home. That's an invalid, illegal consent. And your duty is to take care of the patient inside the hospital, considering that he actually wanted to stay in the hospital. It's just that you said all sorts of things to push him out of the hospital. So that's an act of omission. You didn't do hospital care. So that's, or the act of commission. Like you have a duty, but you did another thing which is contrary to your duty, or you did your duty poorly. That's like a malpractice case. So that's, you breached your duty. You agreed your duty is to do this well, according to the standards of care, and you didn't do it well, or you did some other questionable thing. Okay, so now, for example, there's a disease and it pays you better if you actually go for surgery, but the actual standard of care, if you look for literature, you shouldn't be doing surgery on these cases. But the surgery give you a lot of money so that you can buy an expensive car or go abroad or whatnot. Or you're treating a patient and you're giving a lot of medication because the medical representative is actually watching you and is going to pay for your trip to Europe for a conference. And even if the patient actually doesn't need all those medications and is actually having a hard time paying for all those, you started giving out prescriptions left and right. So that's also a practice that's not what's expected based on your duty to care for the patient, right? So now, you have a duty and you breached your duty, and then you caused damages to the patient and the family. So it could be emotional, it could be financial, it could be physical, it could be all sorts of damages, right? So you harmed the family. So damages can, it's a legal term. Like we don't say you damaged the patient. Although every now and then we say something like that, you damaged the person, but it usually means something else. So damage, as far as the lawyers and the courts are concerned, means harm. You harm the patient emotionally, legally, financially, or whatnot, by not performing your duty or performing your duty poorly. And then all the plaintiff or the patient or family needs to do is just show that there's a proximate cause between the breach of duty and the harm it caused, or the damages, the breach of duty and the damages. We did this and it caused this, and most of the time it's too obvious, right? So of course, if it becomes an actual complaint or court case, you and your lawyer will try all sorts of conceptual or mental juggling acts to squirm your way out of it. You might even come up with an ethical expert telling the patient that ethically, legally it might be wrong, but ethically, you can do all sorts of, especially ethics. Ethics is philosophy. You can argue 24 different ways with 24 different results, and that's ethics for you, especially in today's world where values and morality is very relative, right? So, of course, if it's a complaint and it's a court case, it doesn't matter whether you think it's ethical or moral. The question is whether it's illegal. And of course, the laws reflect the morality of the country or the society. It doesn't matter whether your subspecialty group or your professional group or the entire medical community thinks it's okay. That would be one really corrupt place. But I'm assuming even if that group thinks it's okay, if everyone else in the country thinks it's not, then it's not, right? That's how it works. And it's probably not okay. You just, training and your work environment convinced you to convince yourself that it's okay. That's usually what happens. Be honest to yourself for once, right? Well, sometimes not, but anyway, that's not the topic. And then if it's a civil case, then it's damages. You'll have to pay for the harm. You'll have to pay for the damages. One way of doing that is to calculate how much damage you cause, and you pay for that. Sometimes the law specifies how much you have to pay, but it usually doesn't end that way, because you also caused a lot of emotional harm and suffering, so you have to pay for that also. Even if you haven't caused that much, but the court learned that you actually been doing this for several years, and you've actually been telling young doctors to also do it. As far as the society, some sense of morality and ethics and the spirit of the law is concerned, it's terrible. Then they'll want to punish you. So there's a punitive damages. You're going to be made to pay much more than all the damages you've caused, just to make sure that you don't do it again. That's the same case as the pharmaceutical firms. They have done something terrible all throughout the decades. And of course, anything that involves a lot of billions of dollars, people working inside, and the idea is to earn more. Of course, that's not what they tell everyone. Bad things are bound to happen, and you have well-known court cases amounting to billions of dollars that they lost. Of course, you don't hear the medical representative go around the clinics telling them about those things. In some countries, they don't have the periodicals or the journals to inform them that those things happen. Or if it's so corrupt, you hear about it and you don't pay attention to it because you yourself are doing corrupt practices. Anyway, in those cases, some of them were made to pay hundreds of millions of dollars or a few billions worth, but the company itself, or the amount of stuff they're making, is much more than that. So that's not going to stop them from doing it again, right? What that will do is they're going to come up with several ways so that it doesn't happen again while they're still doing it. So that's the idea behind punitive damages. So it has to be so high that you'll think twice about doing it again. So that's the damage based on what you actually caused, mostly the physical damage, the physical harm, they kind of compute it. So you feel like an economist is computing the cost of everything. Or you can add in general damages, like, add in suffering and emotional distress and emotional harm and things like that. Or in some cases, you can have the punitive damages, make it even higher so that this idiot doesn't do it again. Okay, and then maybe push the case towards the administrative stuff. So maybe this person shouldn't have a license. That would be a terrible punitive damage, right? So anyway, so that's the punitive damage. There's three kinds of damages that you might end up paying for. Now, of course, if it's a criminal act, so criminal act usually means something terrible. It's actually in the law that you shouldn't be doing it, like something that ends with a very severe disability, sort of caused death or a hastening of death. Now assisted suicide would be one of those cases. It's not legal in most places. Now, in places you don't even have laws on advance directives, so you just have to be careful. You don't do that, make the patient sign an advance directive form coming from the United States, where things are fairly legal and they have laws to support it, and not follow the next of kin. If you don't have a law about advance directives, then that paper is just informative. If you did it well. Now, if you have a law and you fudge it, it's just for the sake of them signing it, and say or do whatever it takes for them to sign it, so that you can get them out of the way. That's an invalid consent. That's like at least 3 to 4 cases against you, right? Now, if it ends in death or hastening of death or something really severe, and it goes against the ethical values or the moral norms of the community, then you can end up in jail. Civil cases end up with damages. Criminal cases, as defined by law, ends up in jail time. They can even be put to death if the death sentence is legal. Of course, that involves really bad cases, like death would be one. And I don't think corruption ends in death sentence. I guess it's life imprisonment in some countries, but you have to be really corrupt. Anyway, those are like the general court cases involving informed consents and informed decision making.